Have you ever crawled into the dark, not knowing if the next breath would be your last? I have, and that memory has never left me. Even now, decades after the war, when the world around me is quiet and safe, I can still feel the weight of the earth pressing down on my shoulders, the suffocating silence around me, and the metallic taste of fear at the back of my throat. This was not a nightmare or a movie. This was my reality as a tunnel rat in Vietnam. My war was not fought under the burning sun or in the open jungle where men could at least breathe free air. No, mine was a war beneath the ground, in the narrow veins of a hidden world carved by the Viet Cong, a world so dark and claustrophobic that even thinking about it now makes my chest tighten. Before I go deeper, I want to ask you to stay with me until the end of this story. If you have ever wondered what it truly means to look death in the eye, if you have ever been curious about what courage looks like when it is stripped of glory, then listen carefully. And if you wish to hear more stories like this, stories of men who served in silence and shadows, make sure you subscribe to this channel and follow along. Because the story of the tunnel rats is not only about bravery. It is about sacrifice, fear, and the heavy price of doing a job no one else wanted. We were called many names, but few really understood who we were or what we endured. By the time we are finished, you will see why we were remembered as both legends and victims of a duty that left scars far deeper than any bullet. So what exactly were tunnel rats? The name alone sounds strange, almost dehumanizing, and in many ways it was. We were just ordinary young soldiers, many barely out of our teenage years, given an extraordinary task. The Viet Cong had built an entire underworld beneath Vietnam. Hundreds of miles of tunnels where they slept, ate, stored weapons, planned attacks, and vanished like ghosts whenever our forces tried to strike. The United States Army needed men to go down there, to clear the way, to search, to fight in a place that defied the imagination. But you could not send just anyone. You needed men who were small enough to squeeze through passages that sometimes were no wider than a man's shoulders. You needed men stubborn or reckless enough to push forward even when the darkness closed in. And somehow I was one of those chosen. They called us tunnel rats, and though the name may sound like an insult, we carried it as a badge of survival. We were different from the rest. Infantrymen fought in squads, with rifles and grenades and the comfort of numbers. Artillerymen unleashed fire from a distance, never seeing the whites of the enemy's eyes. But we fought in silence, in spaces where even turning your head was a struggle. Our equipment was minimal. A pistol, usually a .45, sometimes a knife, and a flashlight whose beam barely cut through the darkness. No helmets. No heavy weapons. No armor. Just our breath, our heartbeat, and the endless unknown ahead. And that unknown was never empty. The tunnels were alive. Every inch was a trap waiting to spring. Mines could be buried under a mound of dirt. A sharpened bamboo spike could pierce your chest with one wrong move. A coiled snake might be released as a living weapon. And if none of that ended you, then an enemy soldier crouched in the dark certainly might. I still remember the first time I went down. I was just 20 years old, barely more than a boy, yet old enough to be handed a pistol and told to crawl into the earth. My palms were slick with sweat, my knees scraped against the dirt, and the walls pressed so tight against my body I thought I would suffocate. Each breath was shallow, each movement deliberate. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to back out, to climb toward daylight. But I kept moving. Because someone had to. And because I had no choice. They called us crazy, but the truth is, we were just men who had no choice. That line may sound dramatic, but it is not. Other soldiers, our own brothers in arms, looked at us as if we were a breed apart. They would shake their heads and say, "Those guys must be fearless." But that was never the truth. Fear was with us every second, a constant weight pressing against our ribs. What made us different was not the absence of fear, but the ability to carry it, to choke it down, to crawl forward when everything inside you begged to turn back. Courage in those tunnels was not about heroics. It was about stubborn survival, about pushing 1 inch farther when you swore you had nothing left. When I close my eyes today, I can still see it. The trembling beam of my flashlight dancing against dirt walls. The muffled sound of my own breathing echoing in the hollow passage. The sharp scent of earth mixed with sweat and gun oil. Those tunnels etched themselves into me, body and soul. Even here, decades later, sitting in the safety of my home, I have never truly left them. That is why this story matters. Tunnel rats were not superheroes. We were not fearless. We were young men thrown into hell with little more than grit and a sidearm. And that is why our memories deserve to be remembered, not forgotten in the footnotes of history. So as we begin this journey, I want you to imagine yourself there with me. Imagine the earth pressing against your chest as you crawl. Imagine the silence that is so complete it feels like a scream. Imagine knowing that at any moment, the next inch forward might be your last. This is not Hollywood. This is not a war movie. This is memory, my memory and the memory of brothers who never came back. If you stay with me until the end, you will understand what it truly meant to be a tunnel rat. And you will see how the price we paid followed us long after we left the jungles of Vietnam. Now that you know who we were, let us step back for a moment. To understand the role of the tunnel rats, you must first understand the world we entered, the tunnels themselves. They were not just holes in the ground. They were an empire beneath the soil, a hidden city that shaped the war in ways most Americans never knew. And that is where our story will continue. To understand why men like me ended up underground, you first need to understand the tunnels themselves. The Viet Cong did not just dig holes to hide in. They built a world beneath the soil, a labyrinth that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Some passages were narrow crawl spaces, barely enough for a man to squeeze through, while others opened into hidden chambers large enough to hold meetings, store weapons, or even set up underground hospitals. Imagine an entire city but inverted, everything below instead of above. That was the underworld we were sent to face. These tunnels were not just a military tactic, they were a way of life. The Viet Cong lived down there. They ate, they slept, they gave orders, they vanished beneath the earth when American patrols closed in. The jungle above was a mask, but the true war often happened below our boots. We would sweep a village, confident that the area was secure, only to be ambushed the next day by men who had simply crawled out of the ground like ghosts. The tunnels gave the Viet Cong something we could never fully match: invisibility. For the United States Army, this presented a nightmare. Bombs and artillery could level the surface, but the enemy endured beneath. Napalm could torch the jungle, but the tunnels remained. Helicopters gave us the skies, but the earth itself belonged to the Viet Cong. Every day, commanders demanded solutions. How do you fight an enemy that disappears into the ground? How do you destroy a network that cannot be mapped, where every entrance could be a trap and every step forward might be your last? The answer, brutal in its simplicity, was to send men inside. That is where we came in. Tunnel rats were not born out of strategy manuals or grand military design. We were created out of desperation. The army needed eyes and ears underground. They needed someone to crawl where machines could not go, someone to scout, to search, to kill if necessary. We were expected to fight the enemy on his own ground, to drag him out of his hiding places, to expose the underworld that sustained his war. And so they chose us, not the tallest, not the strongest, but the smallest and most stubborn. Size mattered more than rank or skill. If you were slim, wiry, and compact, the odds were good that one day someone would slap you on the shoulder and tell you that you had just been volunteered. But it was not only size. You also needed nerves of steel. Claustrophobia disqualified you immediately. Panic in a tunnel was not just dangerous, it was deadly. One man freezing in fear could mean both his own death and the death of those waiting above who counted on him to return. So the tunnel rats were a strange breed. Small men with steady hands, men who learned to swallow fear like a daily ration. Our gear was laughable by any modern standard. A pistol, most often the heavy Colt .45, was our lifeline, though the deafening blast inside a tunnel could shatter your ears and leave you half blind from the muzzle flash. Some men preferred smaller revolvers to cut down the noise. A knife was always handy, for cutting through roots, or for the grim possibility of hand-to-hand combat in the dark. A flashlight was standard, though its narrow beam often did more to betray your position than to guide your way. There was no armor, no helmets worth wearing in a crawlspace, no rifles or heavy firepower. Just a man, a sidearm, a blade, and a pocket of courage he hoped would not run out too soon. Every mission began the same way, standing over a black hole in the ground, staring into it like it might swallow your soul. Your mouth went dry. Your palms slicked with sweat. The jungle sounds around you faded as your focus narrowed to that one opening. The sergeant gave the order, and you climbed down, knowing that in the next few seconds, you would leave the surface world behind. The heat grew heavy. The air grew stale. And then, with a deep breath, you lowered yourself into the earth. The tunnel swallowed us whole, and the surface world disappeared. Once inside, the nerves never truly left. No matter how many times you went down, the fear returned fresh each time. You could hear your own breathing echoing in the narrow space. You could feel your heartbeat thudding against the dirt wall. Sweat dripped into your eyes, and your fingers clenched tighter around the pistol grip. Sometimes you crawled only a few feet before you hit a dead end, a false tunnel designed to waste your time. Other times you crawled for what felt like hours, twisting and turning through a maze that seemed alive, designed to disorient and break you. There was always the knowledge that death could be inches away. A wire hidden beneath a clump of soil could trigger an explosion. A step in the wrong direction could mean bamboo spikes through your chest. Even the air itself was a weapon. Some tunnels were booby-trapped with gas or flooded with water. Others held snakes or scorpions released as living traps. And of course there were the Viet Cong themselves, crouched in the dark, waiting with rifles, knives, or simply the advantage of knowing every turn better than you ever could. Before every mission I would stand there, staring at the tunnel entrance, my stomach twisting. I would think about my family back home, about the friends I might never see again. And yet, I went down because that was the job. We did not have the luxury of saying no. Orders were orders, and fear was a burden you carried silently. To the men above it may have looked like courage. But to us it was resignation. You went down because someone had to, and today that someone was you. I cannot explain the kind of silence that lives in those tunnels. It is not the peaceful silence of a quiet night or the comforting silence of an empty room. It is a suffocating silence, one that presses against your ears and fills your head until your own heartbeat sounds like a drum. Every scrape of your boots, every breath, every flicker of the flashlight became a thunderclap in that silence. And with each sound came the dread that someone else was listening, someone you could not see, waiting for the right moment to strike. That was the life of a tunnel rat, to crawl forward inch by inch, knowing that survival was measured not in miles or battles, but in the next heartbeat. Some of us returned from the dark. Some did not. But all of us left pieces of ourselves down there, pieces that no one on the surface would ever fully understand. And that is where my story begins to shift. Because once you understand the tunnels, once you understand why America needed us and what little we had to face them, the next step is to walk with me into that darkness. To feel firsthand what it was like to be inside. That is where memory stops being abstract and becomes painfully, vividly real. When I think back to my first real crawl inside a tunnel, the memory comes rushing in like a flood. The opening was nothing more than a dark hole cut into the earth, no wider than my shoulders. I remember taking that first breath, a deep one, as though I were diving into water, and then lowering myself down. The air was instantly different, thicker, damp, and heavy, carrying the smell of soil mixed with mildew and something metallic I could never quite place. It was not just the scent of the earth. It was the scent of a place that had been lived in, fought in, and stained with blood. The moment I entered, the world above ceased to exist. There was no sun, no sky, no sound of birds or wind. It was only dirt pressing close on every side and darkness so complete that my flashlight seemed more like a toy than a tool. The beam shook with my hands, throwing shadows that twisted and danced along the walls. Every inch I moved felt like entering deeper into another world, one where rules of safety and comfort no longer applied. The space was suffocating. At times the ceiling brushed against my back. At other times, I had to push myself flat on my stomach and crawl forward like a worm. Breathing became labor, shallow and quick, each inhale scraping my throat with the damp air. My heartbeat pounded in my chest, louder than the sound of my elbows and knees scraping along the dirt. It grew so loud that I sometimes wondered if the enemy could hear it too. That was the first thing you learned as a tunnel rat. Your own body betrayed you. Your breath, your heart, even the twitch of your muscles seemed like thunder in the silence. I tried to move slowly, deliberately, but every movement echoed in my skull. Sweat dripped down my temples into my eyes, mixing with the grime on my skin. The darkness pressed down like a weight, and my mind screamed at me that I did not belong here, that no human did. But I pushed forward because there was no turning back once you were inside. Every nerve was on edge. A root brushing against my hand could feel like a snake. The faintest rustle made me freeze. My flashlight beam caught shapes that seemed alive, though most were nothing more than dirt and shadow. And yet I knew that danger was real, constant, waiting only inches away. Booby traps were everywhere, sharpened bamboo stakes hidden in pits, wires stretched across corners that could trigger an explosion. Some tunnels were deliberately collapsed in sections, designed to trap you forever inside. The enemy's imagination had no limits, and each step forward was a gamble. Even the natural world was turned against us. Once, I saw the flutter of wings and nearly fired my pistol, only to realize it was bats disturbed by my presence. Another time, a snake slid across my arm, released deliberately into the passage as a living weapon. My skin crawled long after it vanished. And I knew, with every inch forward, that the Viet Cong could be anywhere, crouched in the dark, waiting for me to appear in the beam of my own flashlight. That was the reality of life below the ground. Constant fear, constant vigilance, and the unshakable knowledge that survival depended not just on skill but on luck. And when luck ran out, the tunnel claimed you. The silence of the tunnel was broken only by the rhythm of my own body, my breathing, my crawling, my heartbeat pounding so hard I thought the dirt itself could hear it. At times, the sound of my pulse drowned everything else. It was like a drum echoing inside my chest, and I had to fight the urge to hold my breath just to make the noise stop. But the deeper you went, the louder that heartbeat became, until it felt like the entire world was reduced to two things: the pounding inside me and the unknown ahead. I crawled forward, pistol ready in one hand, flashlight in the other. Every inch was a decision. Shine the light, and I might see danger before it struck, but I would also give away my position. Leave it off, and I was blind, reduced to feeling the walls like a blind man, praying I wasn't about to press my face into a tripwire. There were no good options, only choices that bought you a little more time. Then came the moments when silence shattered. A scuff of movement, the faintest shift of air, and suddenly the tunnel was alive. One time I rounded a bend and there he was. A Viet Cong crouched only a few feet away, eyes wide, weapon raised. There was no strategy, no time to think. We fired almost at the same instant, the deafening cracks exploding inside the narrow space, the muzzle flash blinding, the air filling with smoke and the sting of cordite. I can still hear the ringing in my ears from that day, a ringing that has never left me. The fight in a tunnel was nothing like combat on the surface. Up there, you had distance, you had visibility, you had comrades. Down below, it was inches, heartbeats, instinct. A knife could be as deadly as a pistol because sometimes there wasn't even room to raise a weapon. Men grappled in the dark, their struggles reduced to grunts and the scrape of bodies against dirt. Victory or death came in silence, marked only by the sudden stillness of one man no longer moving. What haunted me most was not just the fighting but the intimacy of it. To see an enemy's face that close, to watch the fear in his eyes as he saw mine, was to realize that in that moment, you were not soldiers of different nations. You were two men trapped in the same nightmare, clawing for one more breath. There was no glory, no heroics, just survival stripped to its rawest core. After each encounter, after each trigger pulled, there was always a pause, a moment of trembling hands and shallow breaths when I realized I was still alive. Relief rushed in, sharp and overwhelming, but it was always tainted by something darker. Because the more you survived, the more you carried. Every time I crawled back into daylight, blinking at the sun, I knew I had left another piece of myself in the dark. In those tunnels you didn't fight an enemy. You fought fear itself. That was the truth of it. The Viet Cong were deadly, yes, but the real enemy was the terror that seeped into every inch of your being. Fear was the companion that never left your side, the shadow that waited at every turn. And every time you crawled forward, you weren't just fighting a man, you were fighting the weight of your own survival instinct begging you to stop. When I think about what it meant to come back out of a tunnel alive, the memory is always bittersweet. The first rush was relief, raw, overwhelming relief. Crawling back into daylight, feeling the sun on my face, hearing the rustle of leaves and the shouts of men above, that was the moment I knew I had cheated death again. My lungs filled with air that seemed fresher than anything I had ever breathed. My legs trembled as I climbed out, and more than once I kissed the ground, grateful to be standing on the surface again. But relief never came alone. Almost immediately it was followed by something darker. The images from inside clung to me like a second skin. The sound of a shot fired inches away, the eyes of an enemy staring at me before going still, the suffocating silence after it was all over. Even when my hands were steady again, even when my uniform was brushed clean of dirt, my mind stayed in the dark. The tunnel never let you go. Every survivor carried the same haunted look. We would sit together after a mission, sipping from canteens, smoking cigarettes with hands that shook, and no one needed to say a word. Each of us knew the others had been face to face with death. Each of us knew that whatever we had seen in the dark, it would not leave easily. It carved itself into us, line by line, memory by memory. What I realized over time was that surviving the tunnel was not the same as escaping it. Yes, your body came back, but your spirit lingered underground. Nights were the hardest. I would lie in my bunk, eyes wide open, and hear the echoes of the tunnel in the silence. My chest would tighten, my breath would quicken, and I would feel the walls closing in, as though the earth itself was pulling me back down. Sometimes I woke drenched in sweat, certain that I had heard the click of a tripwire or the hiss of something crawling beside me. It was only a dream, but in my heart I was still down there. And yet we kept going back. Mission after mission, crawl after crawl, because the war demanded it. Each time I wondered if this would be the one that ended me, if this was the tunnel I would not return from. And when I did survive, the weight grew heavier. Relief mixed with guilt. Why was I alive when others were not? Why did the earth claim some and spare others? There were no answers, only the gnawing sense that my survival came at a price I could never repay. That was the truth of being a tunnel rat. The fight never really ended when you climbed out of the ground. It followed you day and night, in memory and in dreams. The war beneath the earth was not measured in victories or defeats. It was measured in scars, scars you could not see but could never forget. And while I carry my own scars, the ones that cut deepest are tied to the men beside me. Because no matter how terrifying my own missions were, what haunts me most are the stories of the brothers who went down and never came back. When people ask me what I remember most about being a tunnel rat, they expect me to talk about the tunnels themselves, about the suffocating darkness, the traps, the fear. And of course all of that is there, carved into me as deeply as any scar. But the truth is, when the nights are quiet and memory creeps back uninvited, it is not the tunnels I see first. It is the men. The faces of the ones who went down into the earth with me. The faces of those who came back, pale and shaking but alive. And the faces of those who did not. We were a strange brotherhood, stitched together not by choice but by necessity. None of us had asked to be tunnel rats. We were chosen because we were small enough, wiry enough, and perhaps reckless enough to do what others could not. Out of that strange lottery grew bonds stronger than I have ever known. There were no long speeches between us, no flowery declarations of loyalty. We didn't need them. A look, A nod, the simple act of being there when it was your turn to go down, that was enough. I can still see Carter's grin. He was from Texas, barely out of high school when he shipped out, but he carried himself like he had been born for danger. Carter was thin as a rail, with shoulders just narrow enough to slide into the tightest passages. He had a way of making everyone laugh, even when the ground itself seemed to want to swallow us. Before missions, he'd slap the dust off his boots and say, "If the devil's waiting, I hope he brought a bigger gun." It was bravado, sure, but it lightened the weight pressing on all of us. Carter went into those tunnels more times than I could count. Each time I wondered if it would be his last. But somehow he always came back. Covered in dirt, drenched in sweat, his flashlight flickering in his hand, yet alive. When he climbed out, squinting into the sun, it was as if he had stolen life itself from the earth. I often thought of him as indestructible. But deep down I knew better. None of us were. Then there was Thompson. Where Carter was fire, Thompson was stone. He was the kind of man whose silence made you feel safer, because silence in him was not fear but focus. He spoke little, but when he did, it was worth listening to. In the tunnels, Thompson's calm was a lifeline. You could feel your own panic clawing at you, whispering that you couldn't breathe, that the earth was closing in. But then you'd glance at him, see the steady way he moved, the deliberate pace of his breath, and it was enough to steady your own. The three of us shared missions together more than once. I can still picture one night, the jungle heavy with rain, mud sucking at our boots as we found the entrance to yet another hole in the earth. Carter cracked a joke, Thompson said nothing, and I felt that familiar knot tighten in my stomach. One after the other, we slid into the dark, each of us pretending we weren't afraid. But of course we were. The truth is, bravery and fear lived side by side in every one of us. We were brave not because we had no fear, but because we went down despite it. The bond between us was not forged in victories. It was forged in silence, in the knowledge that we depended on each other utterly. I trusted Carter to keep my spirits alive when despair tried to choke me. I trusted Thompson to keep his head when panic threatened to destroy us both. And they trusted me the same way. That trust was the only currency we had, and it meant everything. Looking back now, I realized that our brotherhood was not about words. It was about presence. The man crawling ahead of you, the man waiting behind you, that was the whole world in the tunnel. If one of you faltered, both of you might die. If one of you pressed forward, both of you might live. It was that simple and that absolute. I often wonder why I remember Carter's grin so clearly, or the quiet steadiness in Thompson's eyes. Maybe because those small human details were all we had to hold on to in the dark. The tunnels stripped us of everything, light, air, comfort, even hope. But they could not take away the bond between us. That bond, silent and unspoken, was our lifeline. And yet, as strong as that bond was, it was never enough to protect us from the truth that hung over every mission. Some men went down and never came back. There is one memory I wish I could erase, but it has lived inside me for decades and I know it always will. It was the night I lost Thompson underground. Carter was with us that day, but it was Thompson's turn to take point. The entrance was barely wide enough to crawl through, damp with rainwater dripping from the ceiling, and I felt my chest tighten as I lowered myself into the dark. Thompson was ahead of me, his flashlight cutting a pale path through the soil, and I followed his boots as if they were the only thing anchoring me to the world of the living. The tunnel seemed endless. Each turn looked the same as the last, each stretch of dirt pressing in closer to my shoulders. I remember the smell, wet earth mixed with mildew, a scent so strong it filled my lungs like poison. We were crawling in silence, just the sound of our own breathing, steady but heavy. Then, in an instant, that sound broke. Thompson's light flickered, then vanished. I froze. In the absolute blackness, I whispered his name. What? Twice. Nothing. The scariest sound was silence, when your buddy never answered back. I inched forward, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every nerve screamed at me to retreat, but I could not. He was my brother and he was just ahead. My hand brushed against something taut stretched across the dirt wall, a wire. My blood ran cold. Before I could even process it, I found him. Thompson lay sprawled, still and unmoving, his eyes wide open. The blast had been muffled by the earth, but it was enough. I remember shaking him, calling his name over and over, as if my voice could breathe life back into him. I remember pressing my hand against his chest, begging for a heartbeat. But there was only silence, the same suffocating silence that had swallowed his voice. In that moment, the tunnel seemed to collapse around me. The weight of the earth above felt unbearable, crushing, as though it wanted to bury us both. Dragging his body back was one of the hardest things I have ever done. Inch by inch, clawing through the dirt, my muscles screamed, my lungs burned, but I would not leave him behind. His body was heavier than it should have been, not because of weight but because of what it meant. Every pull of my arms reminded me that I was dragging not just a man, but a friend, a brother, someone who had shared my fear, my silence, my hope. When I finally reached the surface, the others were waiting. I remember their faces, pale and silent, as I pulled Thompson's body out of the earth. No one spoke. No one had to. In war, you learn quickly that words are useless in the face of death. We simply looked at one another, each man knowing that what had happened to Thompson could happen to any of us on any day in any tunnel. That was the cruel math of our missions. One down, one lost, and the rest of us just waiting our turn. That night, the silence stayed with me. I lay in my bunk, staring at the canvas above me, hearing the echo of my own whispers in the tunnel. Thompson. Again and again. But no answer. Even now, half a lifetime later, I can still hear that silence. It is louder than any gunfire, heavier than any explosion. Silence became the voice of death itself. Losing a man in combat is one thing. Losing him inches away from you, in a place so dark and close you can feel his last breath on your skin, that is something else entirely. It carves itself into you, deeper than any wound. I carried Thompson out of that tunnel, but I left a part of myself down there with him. And I have never gotten it back. What bound us together as tunnel rats was not the words we spoke, but the silences we shared. After every mission, when we crawled back into the light, there was rarely talk of what had just happened. No one asked what we had seen or how close it had been. We already knew. We would sit on the ground, covered in dirt and sweat, breathing hard, sometimes too shaken to stand. Someone might pull out a cigarette and pass it down the line. A glance here, a nod there, that was all it took. In those quiet moments, we said everything without speaking. That silence was our language. It was a heavy silence, filled with the knowledge of what we had risked and what we had lost. You could see it in the eyes of a man who had just pulled himself out of the earth, his face pale and distant, like he had left part of himself behind. And you could feel it in the weight that hung over the rest of us, knowing that the next man could be the one who did not come back. It was an unspoken truth we all carried. Each mission was a gamble, and the odds were not in our favor. I remember nights when a man would go down and never return. We would wait above, straining our ears for a sound, a signal, a shout, the scrape of boots on dirt. Minutes would pass, then hours, until the waiting became unbearable. At some point, the officers would call it, and the entrance would be sealed. That was the worst part, knowing that your buddy was still down there, somewhere in the dark, and that he would stay there forever. Some tunnels swallowed men whole, leaving no body to carry back, no closure, only silence. The scariest sound was always silence. Silence when the flashlight went out. Silence when your partner did not answer. Silence when you waited above ground and heard nothing but the wind through the trees. Over time, that silence became as terrifying as any weapon the enemy used. It was the sound of loss, of absence, of a brother cut away from you in the dark. And yet, in the face of all that, we clung to each other. We clung in ways only soldiers in our place could understand. A hand on the shoulder before a mission. A crooked grin as someone slid into the tunnel. A muttered joke to ease the fear. These small gestures were lifelines, reminders that we were not alone, even when the earth tried to make us believe otherwise. Looking back, I realize now that what made our bond so strong was not just the danger but the certainty of loss. We did not know who it would claim or when, but we knew it would claim someone. And so we held tighter to those who remained, even as we carried the weight of those we had lost. That bond is hard to explain to anyone who wasn't there. It was not about friendship in the ordinary sense. It was about survival, about holding on to each other in a world determined to strip everything away. Even now, decades later, I can see their faces as clearly as if they were in front of me. Carter's grin. Thompson's quiet eyes. The nameless others whose faces blur together but whose presence I still feel in the silence of the night. They are with me always, as real as the air I breathe, because memory has refused to let them go. But memory is not enough. The truth must be told. Too many men went down and never returned. Too many times the tunnels swallowed them, leaving only silence behind. And that silence became the story we carried home. A story of bravery, yes, but also of terrible loss. As I tell you these stories, I want you to understand that what happened to Thompson, to Carter, to the nameless others, was not rare. It was the pattern. It was the reality of being a tunnel rat. And that reality, as painful as it is to say, was that survival was never guaranteed. For every man who came back into the sunlight, another was left behind in the dark. When people talk about war, they often think in numbers: how many battles fought, how many victories claimed, how many casualties endured. But for us tunnel rats, the numbers told a story darker than most could imagine. The truth was simple and brutal: too many went down and not enough came back. Every mission felt like rolling dice against death. Some days you won. Other days the dice came up snake eyes. The tunnels were unforgiving, designed to kill or trap, built by an enemy who knew the terrain better than anyone. If you survived one mission, there was no guarantee you'd survive the next. In fact, surviving once only meant you'd have to face it again and again until luck ran out. I remember the briefings when names were called for tunnel duty. There was always a hush in the room, a moment where everyone silently prayed it wouldn't be theirs. When it was, you swallowed hard and nodded, pretending to be calm. Inside, though, we all knew the truth: the odds were stacked against us. For every man who went down, there was a chance he would not come back. And too often that chance became reality. Some didn't die right away. Some were pulled out injured, burned, cut, sometimes blind from sudden blasts in the dark. I saw men carried away on stretchers, their faces gray and hollow, still breathing but already gone in spirit. Others simply vanished. One moment they were in the tunnel, the next there was silence and they never emerged again. Those were the worst losses because there was no body to mourn, no grave to visit, just the knowledge that the earth itself had swallowed your brother whole. The statistics were never written down in ways the public could see. Official reports glossed over the truth, calling us special operations or hazardous duty. But among ourselves we knew. The survival rate was low, far lower than most other units. Some of us joked bitterly that the only reason we lived long enough to keep crawling was because we were too stubborn to die. But deep inside, we carried the faces of every man who hadn't made it. Even decades later, when I close my eyes, I can still see them. Men like Thompson gone in an instant. Men like Carter who somehow always came back until the day he didn't. Men whose names history won't remember, but who live forever in the silence between breaths. Each face is a reminder that survival wasn't proof of strength, it was proof of chance. We didn't come out alive because we were braver or smarter or better. We came out alive because fate chose us and not the man beside us. And that truth weighed heavier than the earth above us. Because every time you pulled yourself back into the daylight, blinking at the sun, you knew deep down that someone else wouldn't. And it was only a matter of time before your turn came. If the tunnels tried to kill us while we were in Vietnam, the memories of them tried to kill us after we came home. Some wounds you can see, a scar across the arm, a limp in the leg. But the wounds the tunnels left on us were invisible, buried deep in the mind where no one else could see them. And yet, they were the ones that never healed. Even when the war ended, the war inside didn't. At night, I would wake drenched in sweat, my chest heaving, convinced I was still underground. The walls of my bedroom felt too close, the darkness too thick. My wife would tell me I had been shouting in my sleep, thrashing as if trying to crawl away from something. But in truth, I wasn't dreaming. I was back there, crawling through the dirt, searching for a light that never came. Sleep became a battlefield of its own. I avoided it as long as I could, sitting awake through the small hours of the night, smoking cigarette after cigarette just to keep the memories at bay. But eventually exhaustion would win, and when it did, the nightmares returned. Sometimes it was Thompson's face staring at me in the dark. Sometimes it was Carter's laugh, cut short by silence. And sometimes it was nothing but blackness, pressing in until I couldn't breathe. The darkness itself became an enemy. I could not sit in a room without a light on. Basements, tunnels, even crowded elevators sent my heart racing, my palms slick with sweat. My family never fully understood. They would tell me, "You're safe now. The war is over." But for me it was never over. The war had followed me home, buried inside me like the very tunnels I once crawled through. Doctors later gave it a name, post-traumatic stress disorder. But back then we didn't have words for it. We just knew we were broken in ways we couldn't explain. Some men drowned it in whiskey. Some tried to bury it under silence. And too many put a gun to their own heads because they couldn't find another way out. The tunnels had already buried them once. The memories finished the job. I wasn't immune. Loud noises would send me diving to the ground. The pop of fireworks on the 4th of July felt like explosions echoing underground. Even the smell of wet earth after rain would drag me back, like a hook tearing open old wounds. My family would look at me with pity, sometimes with fear, as if the man who had returned was not the same one who had left. And maybe they were right. Part of me had stayed in Vietnam, buried with the brothers I couldn't save. It's hard to explain to anyone who wasn't there. How can you describe what it feels like to be trapped in a tunnel that no longer exists? How can you make someone understand that even in the safety of your own home, the war waits in the corners of your mind, ready to pull you back down into the dark? That was the cruelest truth. The tunnels never really let us go. They stayed with us, in our lungs, in our dreams, in our silence. And even decades later we are still crawling through them, searching for a way out. Among soldiers there were always whispers about us. To the infantrymen we were reckless. To the engineers we were expendable. To the rest of the army we were simply crazy. And maybe they were right. After all, who in their right mind would crawl into a hole in the earth armed with nothing more than a pistol, a knife, and a flashlight? They called us tunnel rats. Sometimes the name was spoken with respect, sometimes with disbelief, sometimes with pity. "Those guys are insane," I heard more than once. But behind the laughter or the admiration was an unspoken truth. Nobody else wanted our job. Nobody volunteered to squeeze into the darkness, face booby traps at arm's length, and fight hand-to-hand in silence. And yet, someone had to do it. So we did. We weren't the strongest soldiers. In fact, most of us were chosen because we were small and wiry, able to slip through spaces others couldn't. But what we lacked in size we carried in stubbornness. It wasn't bravery in the traditional sense. It was necessity. We went because someone had to go, and in that moment courage was just another word for survival. Other units faced danger too, of course. The infantry fought in open firefights, artillery crews endured incoming shells, pilots braved anti-aircraft fire. But our danger was different. Ours was suffocating, silent, and intimate. Death wasn't a distant shell or a bullet from across a field. Death was inches from your face, waiting in the dark, silent until the last second. That made our fight unique and in many ways unbearable. And the truth is, it changed us in ways few could understand. We carried the tunnels inside us, even when we left them behind. While other veterans tried to adjust to civilian life, we were still crawling through the dirt in our minds. The darkness, the silence, the constant knowledge that the next breath might be the last. It never let go. The war never left us. It followed us home. That's the part most people don't see. They see the medals, the stories of bravery, the way history paints us as fearless. But they don't see the nights spent pacing the floor, afraid to turn off the lights. They don't see the way we flinch at fireworks, or the way we avoid basements like they're death traps. They don't see the guilt that eats at us when we remember the ones who never made it back. We became legends in the eyes of some. The bravest of the brave, they called us. But in our own eyes, we were just men doing an impossible job, paying a price we could never escape. Legends don't wake up screaming. Legends don't drown themselves in whiskey just to get through the night. Legends don't live in fear of their own memories. But we did. That's the truth I want you to understand. Being a tunnel rat wasn't glory. It was survival at the edge of madness. It was carrying scars no one could see. It was being called crazy by your fellow soldiers but still going down anyway. And it was knowing that no matter how far you crawled, no matter how many years passed, the war would always crawl with you. And that leads to the hardest part of all. What happened when we finally came home and tried to live again in a world that no longer felt like ours?